Welcome to the Faith and Feelings podcast. My name is Taylor Joy, and I'm passionate about helping you untangle and honor your emotions, authentically practice your faith, and integrate both into your everyday life so that you can experience the goodness and delight that comes from living in relationship with yourself, God, and others. Thank you for joining me. Let's get started. As we begin to wrap up this series on self-awareness with our final interview today, I am so excited to share my conversation with author and ministry leader, TJ MacLeslie. With so much honesty and gentleness, TJ generously invites us into his own story, pulling together so many of the themes we've talked about and emphasizing why growing in self-awareness is so important in our relationships with God. Because at the heart of the spiritual journey is relationship. Christian spirituality involves a transformation of the self that occurs only when God and self are both deeply known. This process of growing in self-awareness is not an end in itself, but the heart and the means to deeper intimacy with God. As TJ says, the spiritual journey is so much more than conceptually knowing God, but experientially encountering Him. And as we walk with God and with each other, committed to staying actively engaged with our own hearts, God reveals more and more of ourselves to ourselves, layer upon layer, so that we can be free. So let's go to my conversation now with TJ. Well, TJ, welcome to Faith and Feelings. I am so glad you're here.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm really glad to be here.
Well, right now we are wrapping up a series on the podcast all about self-awareness, and I have been so looking forward to this conversation with you. I know that we have a shared passion for integration, and I'm really grateful for your willingness to come on the podcast and share some of your story and also why self-awareness is so important in our spiritual journeys. So to get started, I'm curious to know how you would describe yourself when you lacked self-awareness. So what are some words that you would use to describe yourself when you weren't self-aware?
Yeah, I think this may come up frequently as we talk, but I think that there's often layers to conversation, layers to self-awareness. And there's even layers for me to this question. I think on the one hand, there was a sort of ignorance is bliss sort of in childhood and even into my teen years, where I picked up coping mechanisms that worked relatively well for me. So they allowed me to keep things that I didn't want to see beneath the surface. And in that sense, there was in those early days a sense of self-awareness that was completely absent and blissfully so, like on one level, right? But also, I think, and I know, people would have described me. One of my nicknames that I picked up as I think I was 12 or 13 was Mad Dog, and that stayed with me all the way into university. And that was because I think I was really angry. So one of my coping mechanisms was to project anger into the world. In fact, I was taught, even in my family of origin, that anger is a really useful tool. And if you project yourself as angry out into the world, you will get hurt less. That the world is sort of a monster that wants to get you, and so I learned to project that anger, and it was one of the only emotions that I was at least allowed to feel. Sort of in my family of origin. And so those coping mechanisms didn't keep it all at bay. And so when it did come to the surface, I would pretty much translate every emotion. I would skip over sort of sorrow or sadness or vulnerability or betrayal. I would skip all of those things and just go straight to anger, or go straight into other numbing coping mechanisms and strategies, which later on really were prisons. Like I built these walls sort of to keep myself safe, but then found myself trapped within those walls and not able to get out.
Oh, that's so good. Can you tell us a little bit about your journey with self-awareness since that point, and maybe a catalyst that God has used to wake you up to yourself and your story?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Again, I think there's layers to this answer. One of the early ones was when I was in my teen years, I turned to drugs and alcohol and sex even though I grew up in a Christian home and grew up in a church, which we will talk more about that later. I don't know where the conversation will lead us. But the church that I grew up in didn't really equip me for self-awareness at all. In fact, quite the opposite. And so I was comfortable in that self-awareness because I didn't know there was any other options. But then when I was 19, I finally, or just before my 19th birthday, began to recognize that my strategies were not serving me anymore, and that I really wanted more. I wanted to be different than I was. And particularly after I came to Christ or turned to Christ as sort of an adult, because there was many times in my childhood, sort of from 5, every couple of years, I think I prayed to receive Christ again, just to make sure it took. But it was but just that year, just before my 19th birthday, and I turned to the Lord and said, "Yeah, I really believe you are Jesus, who you say you are." But then the freedom that I thought I would find, I did find some, but then very quickly realized I could not stop the addictive behaviors and coping mechanisms. And so I started to realize, like, I'm trapped in this, and I can't find my way free. And I would talk to my friends and my pastors, and they would say, well, just know the truth and do it. And I was like, I'm trying, right? And they would say, well, if you're struggling with lust, you probably need to do another word study on porneo. And so you can see like what it says in the Greek, and then just stop thinking those thoughts, stop doing those things. But I couldn't. And so it was in that process of graciously allowing me to feel that frustration and to feel that trappedness and not just cope it away. And then in seminary was when I decided to finally got to the end of myself. And I had a friend. I went to Talbot Seminary at Biola.
Yeah.
And I had a friend there. They have Rosemead School of Psychology that's also there, which means that Talbot students get deeply discounted counseling because the psychology students need to get their hours, right?
Yeah.
And so I had a friend who said, like, I was trapped too, and then I started doing counseling, and I was like, isn't counseling for crazy people? Which is what I was told in my church, and in fact, as a young person, when I was 11, I was sexually abused by a church youth worker in our church. And when I was 12 and 13, and that rage really started to come forward, my relationship with authority got really twisted. I actually asked my parents when I was still in middle school, or we used to call it junior high. I asked my parents, do you think I could go to counseling? And they said, no, we don't do that. Like, that's, only crazy people do that. Nobody in our family is crazy. Therefore, you can't be crazy. Therefore, you can't have counseling. And that was like my one attempt, even in my early teens. And so I was like, okay, well, that's not a thing. So when I would have been 21 when one of my friends said, hey, I'm going to counseling and I'm finding it really helpful. And I was like, nah, that's not for me. And then he's like, I really think you should at least try it. So I went, and I ended up going 2 or 3 times a week for 6 months. And after the first intake interview, we never really talked about my addictions. But we explored a lot of the things. I didn't know what we were doing. I didn't really understand the process then. But started to recognize, like, these coping strategies are starting to fall off of me, and the rage is lessening. I wouldn't say it's gone. I still struggle with anger sometimes, but over the years since then, that's 35 years ago. So that those were some of the early catalysts for self-awareness and those early steps. But I didn't necessarily have a joined up worldview to know how to think about these things.
Yeah.
Yeah. So those are some of the early catalysts.
I'm thinking about something that a client said to me recently. So she was telling me about something that had happened during the week that had caused her to feel just so much anxiety.
Mm.
And she told me something that has just stayed with me. She said, I was trying so hard and I couldn't find an accurate version of God in my mind.
Mm.
I'm wondering, how was your perception of God maybe formed or shaped by some of those early experiences?
Yeah, yeah. What a great question. I really feel like transformation happens when the real me meets with the real God, right? And that really has never happened yet. I mean, in a pristine sense, right? I'm always, by the grace of God, becoming a truer and truer version of myself, as more and more layers of my false versions of myself are stripped away. And also more and more layers of the false versions of God are stripped away. And I think it was Calvin who said essentially there's no true knowledge of self without knowledge of God, and no true knowledge of God without knowledge of self.
Yeah.
And this is a really ancient. I mean, it predates Calvin. I would even go back to sort of Genesis 3, where God asks, so where are you? It's not like God didn't know where Adam and Eve were, but he asked that question. It's the very first sort of self-awareness question, or one of them anyway, right
Mm-hmm.
from Genesis 3 all the way through. But as I mentioned, the church I grew up in really didn't have that framework. And so I think the my early versions of God, I think, were shaped um, by my parents um, in ways that I wouldn't have been able to articulate until much later. But also by the church I grew up in, and the version of God that I got in that church, which in fairness to that church, I just want to say, like, I got a lot of really great things from the church as well. Like, they taught me to love God's word, and they demonstrated God's love. Individuals in the church demonstrated God's love in some really sweet ways, which still minister to me today. But the overall picture was God as sort of harsh, demanding ruler or judge.
Yeah.
And so one of the verses I remember a lot was, "Be holy because I am holy," which I actually think is a fundamental mistranslation, misunderstanding of that passage. But because what he's really saying is, I think a better translation of that passage is, "You are holy because I am holy." It's not a command. It's not the imperative. If you look at it in the Old Testament, it's not an imperative. It's actually just a statement. You belong to me, right? And
Mm-hmm.
I am holy. Therefore, I make you holy. Therefore, you are holy because I am holy. But that's not how I heard it or how it was presented to me. It was, you have to be holy to be loved. You have to be essentially perfect to be loved. And here's all the ways that you are not measuring up. I remember even I would have been 12 or 13, seventh grade, I think. And we went to a summer camp, and they did a series on the fruit of the Spirit. And so they said, so the fruit of the Spirit is love. Therefore, you need to be more loving. Are you loving? Are you loving like Christ? Because if you're not loving righteously, right? And then they were like, okay, the fruit of the Spirit is joy. This is what biblical joy is. Are you being joyful? So rather than this presentation of,
Yeah.
these are all of the things that come as we are abiding in Christ. This is the natural sap that will flow through you, right? As you're keeping in step with the Spirit. It just became another list of character traits where I wasn't measuring up.
Yeah.
And so that God, I was like, okay, well, I have to do this. And it just became like this unending, unachievable pursuit of something that I, on some level, knew I was never going to achieve. And then when I was abused and by leaders within that church, I was like, well, then none of this is true, right? Because the very people who are telling me I need to be more loving are actually being abusive. physically and then also sexually. And like, so that's, it just completely, I thought, well, if this is what Christianity is, right, then nobody's doing it. So why am I even bothering? So from about age 12 to about age almost 19, I was like, forget about this. Like I'm out.
Yeah. I'm thinking about you as you started to go to therapy when you were 21, 22, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you're starting to sit in some of your story for the first time. What were some obstacles that you encountered as you began this self-awareness journey, and where maybe have you gotten stuck?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, the experience of not being able to get my sexuality under control. I seemed, by the grace of God, I was able to stop the drugs and alcohol relatively easily. But sex, having a right relationship with my sexuality was really difficult, and has been a besetting area of weakness for a lot of my life. And so I was definitely experienced the stuckness there. And then also, I think not having a sort of, it wasn't just that the church didn't encourage self-awareness, it actively taught against self-awareness.
Yeah.
Like that is not necessary. So I didn't have any framework for, or the only framework I had was a negative framework about self-awareness. Like you not only can you should ignore your feelings. I remember hearing multiple sermons on, you can't trust your feelings don't matter, just believe the truth and live the truth. That's all that matters. And so those were not helpful. So as I started to go to counseling, I'm really grateful for the counselor I had and for the counseling in general that I have received throughout my life, including that first counselor. But one thing and maybe it's not the role of a counselor to do this, but I think one of the things that made it difficult was for me to integrate a sort of a biblical worldview. I was in seminary trying to form a biblical worldview, but it wasn't psychology, and self-awareness was almost like this other thing completely separated from the Bible. And I don't think the counselor thought that they were in conflict, but the rest of the sort of professors or many of the professors and the students and the leaders in my own church would definitely have seen them in conflict. So it made it harder then to trust the process and lean into that. And I really struggled. I started that first year struggling to sort of create a holistic worldview or paradigm to integrate these various things. And I eventually came up with something that in my book Design for Relationship, I talk about sort of the 5 circles. There are 5 aspects of our humanity, and God gave us all 5 of them to be an integrated human being, and we were all designed for relationship with God and with one another. And that includes our physical capacities, our intellectual capacities, our volitional capacities, our ability to make choices, our emotional capacities, and our spiritual capacities. But instead of having 5 circles, the church I was raised in only had 2 circles. So it was you had to know the truth, and then you had to choose the truth, right? So it was your intellect and your will, and that was it. And so if you were trying to choose the truth and you couldn't, then you clearly didn't understand the truth enough. So you had to circle. So I kept bouncing back between those 2. Right? So it was just know it, do it, know it, do it. And if you don't do it, you must not know it. So then you would. So we had a strong emphasis, and this is one of the other gifts I received from that church, was a strong emphasis on discipleship. And aligning yourself to Christ, like looking at your character and trying to bring your character in. Although I think they got the cart before the horse. I think if, even Paul talks about, if we all with unveiled faces behold the Lord, then we are transformed from glory to glory. The emphasis is on the, beholding the Lord, or as Jesus talks about in John 15, the emphasis is on the abiding, and then the fruit comes. But it was almost like they got it backwards, that there was an emphasis on the fruit but not an understanding of how that would come into being. And so I started even in those first, while I was in seminary and going to counseling, so started creating a sort of a rubric, a framework to try to integrate it for myself, and bounced it off my counselor, bounced it off other professors and stuff, to try to think, well, how do we think about spiritual growth? How do we think about our humanity? And sort of ended up developing a sort of pastoral anthropology that embraces all of humanity. But when I first did it, I only had 4 quadrants, not 5 circles, because I didn't have the body integrated at all. I didn't think the body mattered.
Yeah.
So one of the things I've really appreciated about your work, and I just listened to one of you, well, for me, it was your most recent, although by the time this is broadcast, it might be later, but your recent one about body work and paying attention to what's happening in your body. And I was trained to do the opposite, both just as a Christian and as, a member of my family, but also I think as an athlete, I was taught to play through pain. And so I was taught explicitly, just ignore what your body's telling you. And that's what real manhood was, to ignore your emotions and to ignore your body. And so when it came to integrating, trying to live as a fully integrated human, there were aspects of myself that I was trying really hard to ignore.
Yeah.
So eventually, I realized the 4 quadrants didn't work. Plus, the 4 quadrants had really nice lines between them, and the 5 circles were all overlapping, right? Because it's very rare that you believe a lie and then can live just fine, or that your emotions are disconnected from your beliefs or from your body, right? We are meant to be, God designed us to be integrated. And so all of these things are influencing each other all the time.
Oh, that's so good. You're putting words to so much of what I've been thinking about and processing recently. Over the last few months, I've been thinking a lot about the suspicion that I think especially the Western church can hold in regards to our bodies and emotions. Jeremiah 17:9, the heart is deceitful above all else, is a verse commonly used to prove the idea that they are untrustworthy. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's something in that passage, but I think that the way in which it's often used is dismissive of our emotions, and dismissive, like as if we can't understand anything about our hearts, right? My wife will often talk about our emotions as being signposts, or like warning lights on the dash, right? Or and I think you talked about this in a recent episode, that are paying attention to our body. Like, what am I feeling in this moment, right? What am I feeling in my chest? What am I feeling in my gut, right? For me, my shoulders tend to creep up and I'm stressed, and I don't recognize that I'm stressed until I recognize my shoulders are up around my ears. And then I'm like, oh, I'm carrying all of this tension. Like, what's going on here? And so the learning to be curious about and attentive to the things that our bodies are trying to tell us and our emotions are trying to tell us. I do think that our emotions, I don't think our emotions are ever deceptive, but they're not always telling the truth about the situation that we're in.
Yeah.
I think Kurt Thompson, I can't remember where he draws it from, but Kurt Thompson talks about that sort of the 80-20 rule, that 80% of what's happening in any given conversation is actually from your past.
So good.
And only 20% is the conversation that you're actually having right now. So like, if you and I are having a conversation and you say a word or a phrase, or you interact with me in a way that, like, I start to feel anxious or afraid, right? My body starts to tell me, like, there's a bear chasing me. Like, that doesn't mean that a bear is actually chasing me, but to be sensitive and aware to say, okay, like, if you feel like a bear is chasing you at this moment, right? You've got that fight or flight, freeze, fawn. You've got that response going on. Your limbic system's on fire. Your prefrontal cortex has gone offline, and you're just in that place. Like, why is that? To be curious about that, to be attentive. Don't just say, oh, that's stupid. There's no bear here. Like, but to be attentive. So in one sense, my heart, if you want to put it this way, like, my emotions are lying to me, are deceiving me in one sense, because there actually is no bear in the room. I'm not actually at risk in this moment. But in another sense, it's not, it's actually telling me a deeper truth. Like, you feel really at risk right now. So paying attention. I think is it Allison Clark? Well, it may just be my wife's take on Allison Clark, but my wife talks about, like, there's parts of ourselves doing parts work, right?
Allison Cook,
Cook,
yes.
that's what it is.
Yes.
Yeah. So Allison Cook talks about in her book, I think it's Boundaries for the Soul, right? So she talks about this idea that there's different parts of me that are coming forward, and instead of exiling those parts of me, which is what I was trained to do, right? Like, no, you shut up, you go away, right? Rather to say, okay, you're welcome here. Tell me what is it that you're trying to tell me, right? And whether that's coming through the voice of my body, that capacity, or whether that's coming through the voice of my emotions, right? Or even through my spirit, like, because the spirit's also there who's speaking to us, right? And so, like, paying attention and saying, what do you want to tell? What are you telling me, right? I'm trying to tell you, like, because the urge might be, oh, you should eat more chocolate, or you should go seek out pornography, right? Like, what they say is, look at porn, look at porn, look at porn. But that's not actually what's happening. What's beneath that is, I don't want to feel this. I don't want to feel this.
Yes.
Right.
So good.
And so then to be curious, to say, okay, what are you saying? What are you afraid of? What are we experiencing right now? And say, okay, I see you there. Right. So welcoming that part of me forward to say, what is it that you're trying to keep me safe from? Even though I reject the sort of coping mechanism you're suggesting, beneath that is something that's true and that I need to listen to. Yeah.
So good. You know, I'm thinking about my freshman year of college. I started reading the Gospels again, and then I stayed there for all 4 years. I was fascinated with the emotional life of Jesus. Isaiah 53:3 describes Jesus as a man of suffering and familiar with pain. And even though I'd read the Gospels before, I began to see how engaged Jesus was with his emotions. He knew what rejection and betrayal felt like. He knew the ache of grief and rejection and loneliness. And I began to realize that the Bible holds so much richness and complexity when it comes to emotions and to our inner lives. So how do you see the Bible teaching us to engage with our emotions?
I'm going to answer a question you didn't ask and then answer that question.
Okay.
So the question because what immediately jumped out at me was, I was also a freshman in college at 18, and I had rejected Christianity because of my bad experiences in the church. But it was the Gospels that brought me to Christ.
Wow.
So I literally sat down and I was like, okay, I don't know if any of these other people know God at all. But I'm going to read, because the crux of the question for me was, is this true? Right? Is Jesus, and the crux of the question really is Jesus who he says he is? And I read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John sort of straight through over the course of a couple of months. And I got to the end of John, and I remember where I could still picture it. I was sitting on a dam up in the mountains looking over a valley, and I was all by myself, and I closed the Gospel of John. And I just felt the question was like, so what do you think? You know, like the invitation to ponder it. And I said to the Lord, like, yeah, I believe you are who you say you are. And so I'm in. I don't know if any of these other people know you at all. And I don't even know what I know, except I know that Jesus is God. And I know that I can't pretend that this isn't true anymore. To be intellectually honest, I need to embrace you. And that I didn't go as deeply at that time as you did as a freshman. I love that you were already engaging in the what I would call today, like, the robust emotional life of God.
Oh, that's beautiful.
Right? Because we see that certainly in the life of Christ. We see many, many different emotions expressed. And also then it opens up this, I think a lot about this, what I call the relational hermeneutic. So when I view, if God in fact is relationship, right? He is an eternally existent community. You could talk about God as a they. We don't usually, but you could talk about God as a they as much as you talk about God as a singular, Like that's one of the beautiful things about the Trinity, is that Jesus was and the Spirit are uncreated and they are eternally existent with God the Father. And so you have this relationship that's at the center of all things. And then we are invited into that relationship as well, right? And given these relational capacities. And so I feel like it demystifies in one sense our relationship with God, because we know how to build relationships with other people. And it would be silly for me to tell you, I love my wife, but I have no emotions towards her. And I don't ever experience her emotions towards me. Or I love my children, but there's no emotional connection. It's just all of the knowledge that I know about each of them, right? And so it changes when we use this relational hermeneutic to read scripture. I find it demystifies so many things and it calls us into this intimate relationship with, I think A.W. Tozer said it this way: we often forget that God is a person, right? And it's silly to think of a person, every person that we know, including myself, including yourself, we all have these robust emotional lives. We all have emotions. And the scriptures describe God the Father, God the Son, and God the Spirit all with emotional language. So our emotions are not a part of the fall. They're not a bug, they're a feature, right?
Yes.
Like and it's part of God's character in us. It is his emotional connection towards us and the opportunity for us to experience his emotional connection towards us and to lean into our emotions as a way of experiencing God. Not the only way, but an important way.
I think you just answered some of this, but would you add anything to why it's so important to stay involved in our inner lives? Like, why do you think this is so crucial in our spiritual journeys?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think, it's what we're invited to. That is actually the invitation to,
Yeah.
I memorized a lot of scripture when I was a kid just because I liked candy, and there's a lot of competition at the church, and you would win candy by memorizing scripture. So, but one of the scriptures I memorized was Romans 8:28, for we know that in all things God works all things together for good for those who love God and are called according to his purpose. But we didn't tie that up with Romans 8:29. I never knew Romans 8:29 until much later. Which is for those that God foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son. So the good is not, when I was a kid, I wanted a Lamborghini. I was like, so if I love God and God's working all things together for my good, he's going to give me a Lamborghini, or he's going to help me make the team, or he's going to help me get on the, get a starting position on the team. And so like the good was always these objective things rather than relational things. But actually, the good is defined as being formed into the image of his Son. And the way that Jesus talks about it in John 14, 15, 16, 17, that last night, that discourse with the disciples, is that I am in you and you are in me and the Father is in us, right? Like we are all interconnected. What we're invited into is that abiding, remaining, relational connection with the Lord. And that relationship doesn't only consist of emotions. It's physical. We physically experience the presence of God. We experience the presence of other people. It's our mind, it's our emotions, it's our will, and it's our spirit. Like all of those things are relational capacities. And so it's nonsense to think to just like the church that I was raised in. One of the things that they often said is that Christianity is not a religion, it's a relationship. But then they denied any relational reality, even though that was a constant refrain.
Yeah.
So it's not that I don't think that we lean into self-awareness as an end in itself. The whole purpose is that we might come to live in relationship with the God who loves us.
Yeah.
And we would come to love him more and know him more and more. And he wants to reveal more and more of ourselves to ourselves so that we can be more and more free. But where I feel like secular psychology, if I could put it that way, falls down is their ultimate goal is human flourishing. And I'm like, human flourishing is like this objective thing. Like I can lift more weight than I could lift last week if I continue to work on myself. But self-perfection, that's just another form of self-perfection. But actually, our goal is union with Christ, right? Union with God is ultimate human flourishing, right? But to think that I could just leave my emotions out or leave self-knowledge, like that's not a part. It's the center of the pursuit.
Oh, this has been such a good conversation. I wish we had more time. But as a final question to wrap us up, one of the things we've been talking about on the podcast is that self-awareness is a lifelong journey. Mm-hmm. So right now, how are you intentionally positioning yourself in spaces to continue catalyzing self-awareness?
Yeah, but that's a great question, because I think I agree. It is a lifelong pursuit. And I can't remember. I think it was Tony Campolo years ago who said, in the pursuit of self-knowledge, it turns out that you might be an onion, right? That you get to know one layer of yourself, right? And then there's another layer beneath that. And you think, okay, now I've got it, right? And then that there's actually maybe another layer beneath that. And I think, Thomas Merton in A 7-Story Mountain, or Teresa of Avila in The Interior Castle, they talk about this idea that there are sort of layers of spiritual pursuit. So a few things that come to mind. One is continuing to read, and often reading. A lot of my mentors these days, I'm old enough now that many of my mentors that I had early in my life have gone to be with the Lord. But a lot of mentors that these days for me are writers. Jean Guyon or Dallas Willard or Kurt Thompson or Teresa of Avila or Julian of Norwich, and reading people who have modeled this lifelong pursuit of the Lord. And what did they learn along the journey? And not everything is going to map directly to my journey, but reading these people who have been on a similar pursuit and saying, oh, that part, I recognize that part. Right. And, I want to try to implement that. And also having building real community, that would be a second thing, so that I have people that I'm discussing even what I'm reading with, and that I'm having authentic, genuine community, with people, that's mutual. And then also, I still do have, I have a spiritual director that I meet with once a month, and I have another friend where we meet twice a month. Once a month where I'm caring for his soul, and once a month where he's caring for mine. So having those people with whom they're just the old Celtic term. It was anam cara, right? Soul friend. Like this idea that, and I think it was St. Bridget, or at least it's attributed to St. Bridget, that a Christian without an anam cara is like a body without a head. Mm-hmm. Like we need somebody. You can't really think of a living body without a head attached, right? We need someone who's just asking after our soul, who's just saying, how are you doing? And how's your relationship with God? And so I would just encourage all of your listeners, if you don't have that in your life, find it. And there's a lot of different, ways to go about finding those resources. It's much easier today than it was sort of 30 years ago, 35 years ago. And I'm grateful for that, the progression of the church towards this integration. It has been a beautiful thing to see in the last generation or so.
Well, thank you so much for this conversation, TJ. I am really grateful for all that you've shared with us today about your story and that you've taught us. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. It's been really good. I have a lot to chew on myself, I think.
Wasn't that amazing? There is so much in this conversation that I've been reflecting on, but one of the things I've been sitting with is this. God is a relational being who longs for a relationship with us. He is a person who desires to know us and to be known by us, to transform us and to free us to live in intimate union with Him. And as TJ says, it takes more than knowing concepts about God to set a heart free. It takes experiences of His presence. After our recording, I asked TJ one more question. How do you want to be described? I've been thinking about his answer since I heard it. I'll be including it in my Substack, which is a weekly resource email that I send out every Wednesday. To listen to TJ's response and hear more of my reflections on today's episode, you can subscribe through the link in the show notes. I'm so grateful that you listened to today's episode. Thank you for spending time with me. I'd love to hear from you. Connect with me on Instagram at TaylorJoy or through my website, taylorjoymurray.co. Also, if you enjoyed this conversation, it would mean so much to me if you took a minute to subscribe and review the podcast. This is an easy way to partner with me and is invaluable in reaching new listeners. Until next week.